Welcome and thank you for coming to the Wilderness Institute's annual lecture series, this year focusing on Native peoples and conservation. I'm Lori Ashley from the Wilderness Institute, and I co-coordinate this series with Nikki Fear. Tonight our speaker is Chris Filard, who will give the talk Where Forests Meet the Sea, Custom, Crisis, and Conservation in the Solomon Islands. Tonight's talk gives us the opportunity to think beyond the North American context and to hear an international perspective on issues surrounding Native peoples and conservation. We're lucky to have Chris with us, a person who has lived and worked in the Solomon Islands. Chris will go ahead and talk tonight for about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll follow with questions and be finished around 8:30. So tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Chris Filard. Chris is a biologist working with the Center for Biodiversity Conservation at the American Museum for Natural History. Chris has, among other things, studied the seabirds of the Palmyra Atoll, the foraging behavior of palm cockatoos in Papua New Guinea, and the radiations of Pacific birds to clarify boundaries among species and begin to unravel the origins of pan-Pacific bird groups. Chris has an impressive background in scientific research, but equally important, Chris is one of the most committed educators, naturalists, and conservationists that I know. Chris has worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society to set up one of the first community-based wildlife reserves in Papua New Guinea. He's helped establish natural history-based undergraduate programs and has tirelessly worked towards efforts that integrate indigenous communities and wildlands conservation in the threatened landscapes of Western North America, Central America, and the Solomon Islands. His current work at the Center for Biodiversity Conservation includes coordinating the symposium Conserving Birds in Human-Dominated Landscapes and integrating research, education, and conservation strategies in the Solomon Islands, which we'll hear more about tonight. Chris and his family moved to Missoula last fall, and since then I've had the opportunity to share with Chris an office and many thoughtful, inspiring conversations. What impresses me most about Chris is his passion and commitment. His passion for the natural world, for real education, and for a conservation approach that integrates Native people and addresses the complexity of land rights, resource extraction, and the local and global forces that determine a future of a place. In the relatively short time that I've known Chris, I've found him to be an extraordinarily passionate, dedicated, fun, and inspiring person. It's with great pleasure that I introduce him to you tonight. Thank you, Chris.
Can the lights get a little softer? Is that possible? Will that happen? You know, and thank you for coming tonight, but I'm incredibly humbled to be here in a lot of ways. You know, when I started preparing for this, I was worried I'd be a little out of place in this series. I mean, I'm a biologist, not an anthropologist even, and I start thinking about Native people and conservation. You know, I'm not native. I mean, I'm native to the planet Earth, but that's about it. But what I think I can share with you tonight is my perspective as a biologist and a practitioner working with Native communities to try to conserve the living diversity or the biological diversity of some of the wildest places on Earth, the islands within the Solomon Archipelago in the Southwest Pacific. And I think before going on, I just want to say a few words about wilderness, just because this is a wilderness issues series, and I apologize for my shadow on the screen sometimes. But wilderness, you know, I grew up in New York City. My sense of wildness and wilderness was born out of cracks in the sidewalk, crazy cabbies, big natural history museums, the Bronx Zoo, dinners with my big Italian family. So when I came out west here and started interacting with more textbook-style wilderness in the Intermountain West in Alaska, I was sort of shocked. There was a vacancy and loneliness in some of these landscapes that made me feel like something was missing there. And I started to question the very concept of wilderness. And I questioned the cultural divisions that surrounded that concept. And I began to look for answers. And in my quest to understand wilderness, I was drawn to the many islands of the Southwest Pacific that are in the region called Melanesia. And I was drawn there because it's one of the last great wildernesses that is not devoid of native people. And it's a place that shattered my conceptions of wilderness or wildness. And it's also a place that I think forced me to restitch a tear in my own thinking that divided human beings from the rest of the living world. And tonight, I'm going to talk to you specifically about some of the things I've tried to do, and I've failed to do, in the Solomon Islands, one specific place in Melanesia. And where the forests meet the sea. It's sort of a hokey title. But the point is where. As many Solomon Islanders have taught me again and again, for native people in the Solomons, and probably for most place-based people anywhere, who you are and where you live are intimately entangled. They're the same thing. So tonight, I'm going to start with a biologist's perspective on where I've been drawn to work, a short journey into and through the Solomon Islands. And then we'll get to culture, crisis, social crisis. And then ultimately, I'll hope to share some of what I'm beginning to learn interacting with native communities, struggling native communities, within some of the wildest forest landscapes of the tropical Pacific. Now, the Solomon Islands are situated just east of New Guinea, as I said, within the biocultural region of Melanesia. And when early explorers left the wispy, coralline islets of the Central Pacific and moved into Melanesia, into the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, they were struck by amazing contrasts in ceremony, in custom, even in the physical appearance of the people there. And the artistry of those people was in stark contrast to the art of Polynesia. And even the physical islands themselves were different. They were bigger, taller. They were cloaked in wet tropical forests from the ridgetops right down to the sea. They were dark islands. That's why they called the place Melanesia. And when early biologists began to explore the biology of these forests, they encountered some of the most remarkable patterns of biological diversity on Earth. Now, the Solomons geologically are incredibly complex. There are 7 main islands across the archipelago, from Bougainville up here in the northwest, which is actually part of the independent nation of Papua New Guinea, and then down through Choiseul to Makira here in the southeast, 1,200 kilometers of open Pacific. 2 nations, the Solomon Islands here and Papua New Guinea up there. But geologically, these islands are formed by a bunch of plates crushing against each other and buckling up out of the ocean. They've been doing this for 20 million years. And the landforms in the Solomons are born out of that buckling, born out of volcanism. And when you're in the Solomons, the complexity of its geological history is incredibly apparent. So there are these little coral islands that you'd expect from a place in the tropical Pacific, but also these bizarre landforms, some of the largest raised limestone atolls on Earth. There are also volcanic landforms of a variety of ages. And as I said, there are these huge mountains that are buckling up from these oceanic plates banging against each other that are big enough and broad enough to create their own weather, which coalesces into these huge drainage systems, some of the largest in the Pacific, which all empty out into the sea in some proximity to another island or landmass, creating this rich mosaic of connectivity and isolation. Now, all this complexity is knitted together by wet tropical forests. The place is blanketed in tropical forest. And within these forests are some of the most remarkable patterns of biological diversity on Earth. Even widespread forms of animals are represented in the Solomons either by unique variants or just strange oddballs, like this thing, Carutia zebrata, the largest skink in the world. It's this arboreal, it's a tree-living animal, it's got a prehensile tail, it eats leaves. It's like a big monkey more than it's like a lizard, found in the Solomons and nowhere else on Earth. And from a biologist's perspective, that's what drew me to the Solomons, is patterns of endemism, the degree to which the life in the Solomons is found in the Solomons and nowhere else on Earth. Of the 30 or so frog species that have been described from the Solomons, there are probably more like 50. There are about 10 species now that haven't been described yet, but have been discovered. So the 30 or 40 species of frogs in the Solomons, nearly 100% of them are found there and nowhere else on Earth. But the patterns of diversity in the Solomons that are the most famous, and really the patterns that drew me there initially, are among its birds. Nearly half the bird species in the Solomons are found there and nowhere else on Earth. Of the remaining half, 2/3 are represented by unique forms found nowhere else on Earth. And what's even more interesting than the fact that all these birds in the Solomon Islands occur there and nowhere else, what's even more unique and interesting than that is as you go from island to island across this 1,200-kilometer archipelago, crossing water gaps of 30 or 40 kilometers, many of the bird species there change in appearance dramatically. And these patterns of change across this archipelago have inspired some of the most influential biological theory of our time. So here, this little flycatcher here, you can see these different forms are varying across this archipelago and across water gaps that are 30 or 40 kilometers. These patterns inspired individuals like Ernst Mayr and other seminal biologists, and really, they invented modern biology based on, or at least large aspects of modern biology based on these patterns. The very essence of how we define what a species is today was based upon patterns that people uncovered among Solomon Island birds. And when I was a grad student and was fortunate enough to go to the Solomons about 10 years ago, I encountered all these patterns intact. They were still there. So I had an opportunity to work on the very same patterns these seminal biologists worked on 80 or 100 years before me. However, the biologists before me really could only look at what birds looked like, what they sounded like, and look at those patterns and how they varied across geology and sort of guess at the history that invented those patterns. Guess at the past events that created the relationships, the divergence, the diversity that they saw today. But when I went to the Solomons, again, I was fortunate enough to go there on the boot heels of the molecular revolution. I was able to look at patterns, genetic patterns, patterns in DNA, that not only enabled me to characterize what prior biologists could characterize, diversity across space, but I could essentially look back in time. But in order to use genetics to sort of reconstruct historic relationships among birds in the Solomons, I had to get blood and tissue and DNA, bring it into a laboratory. I had to get somebody to analyze the stuff, which namely was my wife, Catherine. But we had to get this stuff into the lab. And to get samples into the lab, we had to travel the entirety of the Solomon archipelago. We had to travel to all the main islands across that huge 1,200-kilometer archipelago. And there was great opportunity here. And it wasn't an accident. We wanted a scientific project that would force us to travel across the entirety of this archipelago, because as we traveled among the large islands in planes and tractors, as we moved along the coastlines of these islands, up into the big river valleys, into the interior, everywhere we went, to set up these little camps to get the samples we needed for our research, everywhere we went, we'd be interacting with native peoples. And the Solomon Islands in some ways are unique in the world, well, Melanesia, in that nearly all of the landscapes within the Solomons are held via customary land tenure. That is, the individuals living within these forested landscapes are the sovereign rule makers, are the sovereign governors of access to, stewardship of, and ultimately conservation of the forests within the Solomons. So not only were the landowners and individuals we interacting with wonderful guides, not only did they embellish our science amazingly, but we were also interacting with the people who owned the land. We were interacting with landowner-owning communities, building partnerships with landowning communities that ultimately we hoped would enable conservation. And what I want to talk about now, first, is custom. And essentially what I feel, some of the highlights of what I feel were critical for us to understand to begin attempting to attach native peoples and conservation across this archipelago that we've come to be so inspired by and so drawn to. Now, as I said, the Solomons are sort of geologically complex, 7 main islands, but they're even more culturally complex. Across those 7 islands of the Solomon archipelago, there are no less than 80 living languages. And these are mutually unintelligible languages, not just dialects, not like a guy from Brooklyn and a guy from the Bronx. This is like English and Hungarian, 80 languages. And there are cultures paralleling that linguistic diversity. And in addition, as I said, with that linguistic diversity, traditional patterns of land tenure, diverse traditional patterns of land tenure or land ownership are still intact to this day. And these patterns of land tenure reflect an intimate relationship that people have with the interface between the land and the sea that is so prevalent in an oceanic archipelago like the Solomons. Despite people living far in the interior and right down to the coast, the ocean in the Solomons is their highway. The ocean is their internet. It's their source of communication, new knowledge. It's also a significant source of protein. But unlike people further out in the Pacific, people in the Solomons are deeply tied to forested landscapes. Not only for sources of protein via hunting, but more importantly, for their agricultural base. As far as we can tell, for over 30,000 years, the native peoples of the Solomon Islands have been practicing agricultural systems, diverse set of agricultural systems. Some combined with hunting and gathering, and in some parts of Melanesia, agricultural systems are incredibly complex with irrigation and population densities that approach that of Holland historically. And these systems are still intact and are deeply tied to the forests in the Solomons. And also all their material wealth with regard to housing, leaf for roofs, wood for canoes, wood for framing houses, all of this comes from their forested landscapes. And of course, fresh water. These large riverine systems within the Solomons are people's source of fresh water for drinking, for bathing. And they're also an important place of gathering. And these places of gathering, particularly these rivers, are critical in that they relate intricately to an oral tradition that's still intact. An oral tradition that really has transcribed this 30,000 years of history with this land-sea interface, with these diverse patterns of land tenure. All of that has been kept alive via oral traditions, and oral traditions that relate deeply to where these people live. There are places along their rivers where people meet on a regular basis to tell specific stories over and over and over and over again so nobody forgets them. Their cultural memory through oral tradition in some ways I think is superior to some of our memory with the written word. I mean, sometimes it's just hard to wade through everything we have. All the important stuff gets remembered here. And it gets remembered through reiteration, not only in these places, but through extended family structures. Everything that's done in the Solomon Islands, whether it's weaving leaf for a house, getting timber, framing timber, putting together a house, everything that's done in the Solomons is really done through extended family networks. And these networks aren't just by blood. Obviously, they're also by marriage, but they're also by tradition. There are oral stories that talk about peoples that have joined, different language groups that have joined, languages that have hybridized, and those oral traditions bind those people together, and extended family groups include that kind of history. And what's always, I think, been remarkable to me, and actually really attractive to me, being from an Italian background, you know, when I was younger, we lived with my grandparents, and you know, all generations were in one house, for better or worse, sometimes for worse, obviously. But here in the Solomons, particularly with oral tradition, all of the storying, whether formal or informal, transcends generations, includes all generations, and includes them repetitively. Again, this is part of that memory, part of that cultural memory of who you are, and part of that collective memory of where you are. It's critical to life in the Solomons. What's also intriguing is within these extended family networks, anybody can become a visionary leader. These are relatively egalitarian cultures. Anybody can become a big man or an elder woman who has a significant voice or vision within the community. If you navigate the social network around you well, you're going to be a powerful person. So along with this sort of egalitarian kind of culture comes what, at least in a modern context, can be a cost. And that is the fact that any power you gain is part of that extended family network. Any power you gain is power that the whole unit gains. Your successes are successes of the unit. Any of your possessions are those of your whole extended family network, of all the people in some ways of your language group. Your Wantoks in the colloquial pidgin of the Solomon Islands. Wantok meaning one talk. Your Wantoks. This Wantok system has been essential, I think, to the cultural survival of many people in the Solomon Islands, but it has its costs when you start thinking about a monetary economy and modern politics. And I'll get to that in a bit. But just as an example, this woman's sitting in a little shop. It's empty. About 4 months ago, she set this up on the island of Makira in the Solomons, and she was doing great. She had all kinds of stuff in there. Her inventory was growing. She was making money. And her Wantoks, the people from her extended family network, the people who spoke her language, started coming up, oh, I need a little tinned fish. Just a little bit of rice. We've been waiting for rice for months. I need a little bit of rice. Oh, and you got noodles. Oh, I need a few noodles. And within a month, the shelves were empty. The shop was bankrupt. I mean, she's still smiling. It's a great place to meet at night. But small businesses die rapid deaths across Melanesia. And this is just part of the culture there. And it's part of this Wantok system. And I'll get back to that soon. But another aspect, this Wantok system, in terms of cultural survival, another aspect of cultural survival that I think has been really significant in the Solomons is exemplified by their spirituality. So like everywhere in the Pacific, there's a huge missionary influence. And in the Solomons, it's Christian. Bunch of different forms of Christian, but it's Christian. I mean, I've been out in the middle of nowhere, and I meet guys named Valentino. Like I feel like I'm in the Bronx, and because they're Roman Catholic. But what's interesting about the Solomons, despite accepting Christianity, across the board, all these 80 different language groups accepting Christianity, getting the New Testament written in their language. That's something I'd love to talk with people about later. It's a neat thing. But they did accept Christianity, right? But not totally. They didn't accept Christianity and throw out all this oral history, 30,000 years of oral history, 30,000 years of a relationship, both physical and spiritual, with this land-sea interface. They didn't throw it out. So that blended religion, right? The acceptance of Christianity, the acceptance of sort of the modern benefits that came with missionaries, like airstrips and canoes and stuff like that, without throwing away their culture. That's key here. Now, like many places across the sorry, I'm blocking your view here. But like many places across the world, developing world, there's a colonial history here in the Solomon Islands. And I'm just going to give you a brief sense of that. But a critical part of that colonial history is World War II. Many of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific campaign of World War II were centered in the Solomon Islands. The Battle of Guadalcanal, Red Beach, Bloody Ridge. Many of you may have relatives who died within the Solomon Islands. I mean, a lot of people I meet have relatives who died on the beaches that we've worked on in the Solomons. And it's a poignant place for that. But the Brits got there long before World War II, in the late 19th century, and they had economic interests. Copra and other nut oils, timber, fisheries. But the one thing I want to say about the British is they really deeply respected Solomon Islands culture. There's a reason why it lasted, and the British really respected it. They didn't try to snuff it out, like so many dominant cultures have done all over the world. And I just want to mention that. But let's jump right up to World War II. In the 1940s, you had this huge change in the Solomons. The war really brought the rest of the world to the Solomon Islands. This is Bloody Ridge in Guadalcanal. A distant relative of mine is dead somewhere in there. I mean, they found him, but pieces of him are probably there. But during the war, everybody, after the war, during and after the war, everybody, all these inland villages essentially became vacant. Many of them were vacant already, but they all traveled down to the coast to interact with the infrastructure left over from the war. This is a road that's 65 years old, still sitting there. No cars, but the road's there. And ports burgeoned. International commerce became a part of Solomon Island life, and people moved to the coast to interact with this. And for the first time after World War II, the entirety of the Solomon Island nation, this new independent nation, or not independent yet, but this colonial entity, for the first time after the war, it was integrated by commerce, integrated by shipping. So all these diverse cultures began interacting with one another for the first time. But despite all this development, even the biggest city, Honiara, the capital city, 30,000 people, 35,000 people, order of magnitude bigger than anywhere else. Even that city's a sleepy little town. And just as an example of sort of how people have dealt with all the recent change, this is the home of a friend of mine who works for the government. Their land is cultivated. This is right in Honiara. Their land is cultivated. That's where they get most of their food. The materials to build this house were gathered and crafted from the bush right around there and just outside of town. And about 1.5 kilometers away is the sea. This connection to the land-sea interface is still completely intact, deeply intact. as is their connection to the Wantok system. Now, when Solomons gained independence from the British in 1978, that connection was still there. And I just want to make one quick point about this. The connection to that Wantok system was there too. And you can imagine, I mean, if you gain political power, that's some real power you've gained. All of your Wantoks are going to have helped you get that power. And when you get it, it's theirs too. Now, without going into this in too much detail, you can imagine that creates this incredible cycle of cronyism, of incredible inequity in terms of the distribution of power, and in terms of the distribution of resources, and even access to resources, like international markets. So the Solomons, in many ways, has been crippled by the very system that has ensured cultural survival for many of the people there. This Wantok system, this system of nepotism, has been a real problem for Solomon Islands politics because of the inequities it causes. And consistently, the cultural groups with the largest extended family networks, the largest set of Wantoks, the largest language groups, are the ones who control most power. Oh yeah. So, another aspect of independence that I think is important to recognize that relates to the British is customary land tenure. The British really respected this in the Solomons and wanted to formalize its inclusion in the independent government structure that began in 1978. And they actually spent a couple of years before then working with this government to establish structures like a customary land court that would support customary land tenure. And what this customary land court does is it recognizes a very important aspect of Solomon Islands land tenure or Solomon Islands land ownership. And that is, similar to the Wantok system, landscapes are, for lack of a better word, owned collectively. They're owned by language groups, by sets of Wantoks. And this is critical. Many Solomon Islands cultures in their languages don't have a word for own. It's either you're carrying something, you're sharing something, you're bringing something, you're taking something. You don't really own much. It's not yours, particularly the land. You're in the land, you can't own it. So this customary land court was set up to respect and mediate that collectivism. Disputes among landowning groups would be mediated through this customary land court, would be immune to specific points of law as a way to respect the traditional patterns of land tenure, to traditional dispute mediation as well, in a formalized legal framework that could set precedent and write this stuff down. And it kind of works. However, the British, and everybody in the Solomon Islands too, you want to make money. And we'll get into this in a minute, but you want to make money. And to make money, you got to sell stuff. And to sell stuff, you got to own it. So there were a whole bunch of regulatory acts of Parliament that essentially transferred rights of use, rights of sale to individuals for timber, for minerals. So here you have a customary land court that says no one person can own the land. But you've got regulatory acts of Parliament that says an individual can sign a piece of paper if they have timber rights, if they have mining rights. An individual can sign a piece of paper and legally sell stuff that's not totally theirs. This is a deep contradiction in the life of Solomon Islanders. And it's precipitated a crisis that has crippled the Solomons and crippled the ability of native people to successfully steward their resources in some ways. However, I think my point tonight, I want to briefly give you this crisis, but crisis can disable, but it can also inspire. And I hope I can show you how I think this crisis in the Solomons, as crippling as it's been, has inspired, I think, the beginning of greatness. Really, the beginning of a set of native people's ability to truly conserve the landscapes that are who they are. So in the contemporary Solomon Islands, like anywhere, many places around the world, as you start to develop, you start to engage with the rest of the world, you get health care. Tribal warfare goes away. Headhunting, this is a big headhunting place. I haven't gone into any of that cool, gruesome stuff, but I mean, they really did headhunt here till very recently. But healthcare and peace equals population growth. Population growth, the intrinsic rate of population growth in the Solomons hovers somewhere around 4%. It's huge. It's almost 3 times the global average. And this population growth has put an incredible amount of pressure on both the forest and marine resources of the Solomon Islands. Even their traditional practice of agriculture now is putting pressure on the systems that have sustained them for well over 30,000 years. And along with population growth are growing cash needs. People want money now because with colonialism, modern medicine came in. Inoculations, they cost money. They're wicked bad tropical diseases here, man. It's terrible. I mean, as you can imagine, you know. They want inoculations, but also conditions that were a death sentence just 15, 20 years ago, just before independence. Conditions that were a death sentence are now potentially curable if you got cash. And one of the ways to get cash to engage with this new world is education. And although these people are oral people, to engage collectively with the centralized government, to engage with the rest of the world, you need to be literate. And schooling gives you that, and that costs money too. School fees are the major cash need for these people within the Solomons. And essentially, they draw their cash, they get their cash from the natural wealth within the lands that they hold. Fisheries are huge within the Solomons, both internally. Fish trade within the Solomons is a major source of income for many families, but also some of the fish species within the Solomons are incredibly valuable. I don't want to go into this, but there are live reef fish trade in Asia that puts a huge value on a bar-cheeked coral trout like this. Incredible value. Also, forest products, both non-native products like copra, and also native nut oils are a great source of income for Solomon Islanders, and also raw timber. The timber within the Solomons is some of the most valuable tropical hardwood on the planet. I mean, for any of you who know, there's vitex, some really valuable species of terminalia, there are mahoganies, really exceptional timber, and another source of income. And recently, more recently, and increasingly, tourism is a huge source of income. The fishing and diving in the Solomons is really unparalleled in the world. Plus, you've got this incredible social landscape that tourists can interact with, and people will pay for this. They'll pay big money for that. But for all these things, you need access to these markets. You need access to international markets. The cash has got to come from somewhere. And most people in the Solomons, it's a subsistence economy. It's a land-based economy. They don't need money to live. They need money to excel. They need money for medicine. They don't need money to survive. But you need access to markets, and access to markets is mediated by the central government. And the Wantok system has crippled this for the vast majority of people across the Solomon Islands. And recently it came to a head. One landholding group really dominated all the power within the capital and within Parliament, and really wasn't listening to cries for a change for a long, long time. And I'm simplifying a complex pattern, but I can't go into it here. But didn't respond to cries for, we got to sit down and talk about this. This is incredibly, there's an inequity here. We're feeling oppressed. We need access to these markets. And it turned into a violent conflict. And one landholding group violently took over the country in a coup. Took over the whole police force. All military apparatus in the country was taken over violently, and the entire economy of the Solomon Islands collapsed. All expatriates were evacuated by I was there, my wife and I were there. We didn't get evacuated. The US didn't care about us, but every Australian, everybody, the big planes came, evacuated everybody. Economy collapsed, and there was no law and order. It was terrifying. People were frightened. For the first time in my life, I saw people in the Solomon Islands genuinely frightened of one another. It was a return to tribal warfare, but with guns, like big guns. So in the basement of the Parliament building, this interim government cried help, said, Australia, put together something, come over here and restore law and order. We need your help. And they came. And as much as this was a collaborative force, in good faith, in goodwill, make no mistake about it, this was a foreign military power coming in and taking over the country. And they did restore law and order. They confiscated all the guns, and scary guns. I mean, I'd never seen any guns really in the Solomons, and all of a sudden there's I don't know what the name of it is, but big guns. They confiscated all of them, they destroyed them, and they did return law and order to the Solomon Islands. And in the wake of that return of law and order, there was great, great goodwill. There was great goodwill. Even far out into the rural areas. They turned the name of this thing into, instead of the regional assistance mission, it became Help 'em Friend, Help Friends, you know? It was good, there was goodwill. Law and order was back. But economically, the rural economies in particular basically remained boarded up. They didn't recover. They didn't respond. And this, again, engendered a huge amount of resentment. People struggled, were losing faith in their collective entity as an independent nation. And in the face of all this, with growing cash needs, the one industry that not only survived but increased in intensity was the export of raw logs from the Solomon Islands. And illegally or legally, it's accelerated over the past 5 years. I mean, that cultural conflict, I probably didn't say this, it started in around year 2000. And since that conflict arose to this date, on one of the islands in the Solomons, Isabel, just about 70% of the accessible primary forest on that island has been logged in that time. And this is an island that's about 200 kilometers long and varies between 50 and 65 kilometers wide. And I don't want this to be a doomsday talk, but this is a big problem. There are large numbers of people in the Solomons who are gaining no benefit from this and are directly paying the costs of this logging through their subsistence lifestyle and a loss of that subsistence lifestyle. They're not getting any money from this, and all of a sudden they need money to pay for water. They need money to pay for food, and they can't do it. So I want to talk quickly about conservation now. I want to end with a story about a place that I think exemplifies what I think is the great dependency that Native people have on conservation in the Solomons and the great dependency that conservation has on these Native people. And maybe because I'm a biologist and maybe because I'm a little bit of a teacher, I need to step back a little bit because this word often bothers me. Conservation of what? So let's just define it here, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm sure there are 20 definitions of this or 20 interests here in this room. That's fine. But I'm talking about conservation of biodiversity. That's what a lot of biologists want to conserve, is biodiversity. And that is the variety of life on Earth and all the processes that sustain it. There should be 24 people in here who are rolling their eyes right now. So the variety of life on Earth and all the processes that sustain it. Biodiversity conservation. But it's not about biodiversity. What I think myself and many biologists are interested in conserving is nothing that's here now. It's sort of a certain kind of change. What we're hoping to conserve is the capacity for the world to reinvent itself in an uncertain future. And biodiversity essentially is the currency that fuels that capacity for reinvention. That's what we're interested in here. And so my students, when I talk to them about biodiversity, I say, this picture is a great picture that depicts this, the variety of life and the biological and non-biological processes that sustain it and generate it. It's great, right? There's no people in this. And in the Solomon Islands, this makes no sense whatsoever. And what I hope you're going to get when I'm done here, and maybe in our discussion afterwards, is that Native people and biodiversity conservation in a place where people have never been torn out of where they're from, they're part of it. They are it. And that capacity for reinvention is intimately entangled with the capacity of Native people to persist in these landscapes. So I want to take you to a place called Kolumbangra, an island that blew me away when I began interacting with it. It's a famous place biologically, but it's an incredibly moving place. It's here in the New Georgia group, this little sort of volcanic skid mark behind the tectonic onslaught of these islands here. And the high elevation forests of this volcano, Kolumbangra, are one of the most remarkable places on Earth. As you ascend the ridge lines up into this forest, you leave the wet tropical forests of the lowlands, and you get up into another world, a world that's more kindred with the Pacific Northwest, more kindred with, with parts of Japan than it is with anything else in the Solomon Islands. And within these forests are remarkable organisms. At least six bird species are found in the forests of the crater rim of this volcano and nowhere else on Earth. We're in the process of describing a seventh species that's found only in this 2-kilometer-wide caldera of Kolombongra. Now, Kolombongra is a very unique place culturally as well. Here's a view of the island here. All these red lines are roads. Now, Kolombongra is unique in that this top pie chart here is what's called alienated land. It's in control of the government, and it's alienated because long ago, during colonial times, everybody started going down to the coast, as I said, to interact with shipping and goods and economy and stuff and, all this stuff. It's like going to the city, And, but here, these people lived in proximity to some of the fiercest headhunting and warring tribes in the Solomons, the Roviana people. And they didn't lose those ways easily. They were still doing it when these people went down to the coast. So they went down to the coast and took off, alienating this land. So the government took all this over. These people here, I don't know if you can see it, there are these little hilly areas right in here. And within these forests are these stone cloisters that have existed for thousands of years, where the people from those areas essentially had a method of hiding from these other warring people. And they had no problem moving down to the coast, living up there. They stayed. And this is a picture from Google Earth. And this area right here is the area that's controlled by the people who stayed in those cloisters, which are right in here. And you can see right down here, this strip of forest right up from the coast, right up to these cloud forest crater rim is completely intact. The rest of the island, I hope you can see this, all the way around here, all of the forest below 400 meters has been cut. All of it. This is the last strip of coast to cloud forest environments on Kolombongra. And the birds from this entire crater rim area all concentrate in this strip in their daily commute to access mature forest trees that fruit and flower on a continual basis and are a requisite part of their lives. But what's even more amazing about this place is the people. The reason why that place is there is people like this guy, Joseph Gemu. Him, some other people who are still there now, through their oral traditions, through their linkage to that place, said, we're not going to log that place. We're not going to trade sort of a certain future that has some money in it for our past connection, and the potential that that past holds for us to invent our own future. And it was this linkage with Joseph Gemu that I had that, as quirky as it sounds, that's why we began to work here. Because there was that connection. Because our aspirations were similar. They weren't the same. They didn't come from the same place. He's from 30,000 years in the Solomons. I'm, a generation in the Bronx. But they didn't come from the same place, but they joined in terms of compatibility. And so in terms of linking my interests, his interests, our collective interests, there are a few key components. You have individual landowners, but really it's landholding communities who potentially have the power to conserve, steward, continue to engage with these landscapes. So to get to forest protection, individual landowners need to be collectivized in a way that has some traction in the contemporary context of the Solomons. And there are a lot of ways I could present this to you, but to get from individual landowners to landholding communities with a capacity to govern themselves, to steward the landscapes they've lived within for millennia, you need some level of awareness of this process, awareness of the potential of that process, and some capacity to collectively engage both with other communities and with the national government, to engage to advocate your interest ultimately in forest protection. And the way we worked on this was both informally, a lot of talking, a lot of going out into these villages and just being with people for long periods of time, living with them, bringing my family there, my children there, getting malaria with them, having them help me with malaria. All of that is part of what engendered the kind of spirit that made this start to work. We also went through formalized meeting structures. This is a conch that's been used for at least 100 years. It looks beautiful, doesn't it? It's 100 years old. People have been blowing in it, 100 years of spit, and it's cool. I'm a genetic biologist, so it's kind of cool. But anyway, these formal meeting structures were key in that one of the things we were able to do with some local non-government organizations that were interested in good governance is to work hard to have Solomon Island activists help us engage whole communities in this formalized process of trying to get them to collectively begin to build the capacity to govern their landscapes. And one of the key components of this, and again, I can't get into this here, is many of the women's groups are some of the most powerful groups within these communities, but they often don't engage with the overt leadership, which is male. Many of the cultures within the Solomons are matrilineal, meaning that land is transferred down female lines. You will never, ever hear a woman talk about that. Whenever you talk about the land, it's a guy. But you can bet your buttons that at night when he's at home, she's talking to him. So we tried to engage these folks formally, and it began to work. It really began to work. And one of the things we were able to do, and one of the things that was suggested, that was gleaned through these meetings, particularly from women, is they said our oral history scripts our relationship to the land. Our genealogies, our knowledge of who's related to who, and back deep generational knowledge of who's related to who, is in our heads. That oral history scripts our claims to these landscapes. So one of the things we began doing with these folks is to essentially transcribe this genealogical knowledge into big family trees. These are just family trees that show relationships through time, back several generations, in some cases 10 generations back. And we then took those genealogies and we linked them to this last forest to cloud forest continuum, and we linked them to the communities that were really interested in maintaining the integrity of those forests for their own livelihoods, for their own potential to reinvent themselves. And this started to work. It started to work. But if these people are going to collectivize, they're going to register their land, they're going to get the government essentially to become aware that they are collectively managing their land and that customary land court should support their right to collectively manage that land. And they've got the capacity to do it as well. But for this to work, they still have those cash needs. They need medicines. I mean, you can't watch your child die when if you had 200 Solomon dollars, they could live. You can't do that. You can't. And schooling, they need money for school fees. They need economic alternatives. If they're not going to log, and if the economy is so crippled that that's where cash is coming from, they need economic alternatives. But what's remarkable is that they are there in spades. Exporting raw logs in the Solomons is insanity. Nobody in the Solomons makes any money off of that. They'll make $10,000 in an afternoon when the guy who's exporting the timber makes $10 million. So just doing some value-added activities, just milling a little bit of timber, cutting less, selling it for more, brings Native people more money. This timber is worth less, right? It's not selling for as much on the global market, but it's bringing these people more. And it's done in a more sustainable fashion. Also, other forest products. Copra plantations can work if they're small. It's a good source of a little bit of income. Also, other native nut oils are another thing we've been trying. Biologists themselves, right? This is a huge draw for biologists and their students. Can come, pay money to work in these forests, pay people to help them, pay people to teach them about the biology of these forests. And this is beginning to gain some traction. We're getting some biologists from the United States, from Australia, from New Zealand. There's a huge Danish expedition called the Galathea 3 expedition, which is going to visit this site and several others, putting a lot of money into these local communities because they have these intact forests. And a quick aside that I have to make here before finishing up is that as a person in this country, as a Western person, I've had access to orders of magnitude more resources than any one person should ever have access to. And I am completely indebted to Native people all over the world for that. I think any of us who've had that kind of access are incredibly indebted. And we should pay that debt off. All these people have to do is follow our lead in terms of our patterns of resource use, and we're all screwed. If they liquidate their resources like we did ours all over the world, Some of the richest, last, best biological places are in the control of people like this on the Solomons. So I'm not opposed to direct payment, leases, generational leases of areas that either give in-kind benefit or direct support to communities interested in conservation. So all these economic alternatives were there. This structure was there. But you know, without recognition, without good governance, without that customary land court being recognized by political powers that be, this whole thing falls apart. And in those lowland forests, one member of parliament cut a deal with a logging company that I won't mention, and lubricated a couple of landowners, like a couple meaning two people, with alcohol, prostitutes, all this stuff. It doesn't always happen like this. The timber industry is great in a lot of places, but this is how it happened here. Lubricated a couple of individuals, literally with alcohol, prostitution, trips to Australia, got them to sign a few papers, and they started logging adjacent to those forests, and then began logging illegally within the forests. And despite protests that involved all sectors of these communities, petitions that, this gets me worked up to think about this, petitions that resulted in a court injunction that said all this logging was illegal, it should cease immediately, despite us being on the ground, radioing to the police. Come up here, they're logging, stop them. Nobody came, and the logging happened. And this happened in a place that people have been hunting, walking, living in for thousands of generations. And they didn't want it to happen, and it happened. And because it was illegal, it happened horribly. I mean, there are different kinds of timber extraction. And the timber extraction here was it was more like rape. They logged right down to the stream edges, despite you're supposed to have a 200-meter buffer. They drove their skidders in the water. The water supply of the largest national secondary school in the province doesn't work anymore. They're importing water for their 800 students because their water supply is all silted up from this red clay that flows down there. It rains every day. The water's silted every day. They can't drink it. They can barely bathe in it. It gets muck in your ears, that red silt. This was devastating to the people here. And as trivial as it sounds, it was really heartbreaking for me. But what was really remarkable is that this didn't cripple anyone here. Some of the women's group got incredibly angry. This is a poster that was distributed by some of the women's groups. And they were saying, look, we came from these ancestors who were unbelievably self-reliant. We came from these ancestors who basically invented agriculture, who invented forest products. They were totally self-reliant. And now we need help. We need to trust this government. We need them to help us kind of get our act together. What in the world is going on? People were angry. And people also became resilient and inspired. And several individuals that we had been working with sort of found the ethical compass to really stop this logging. They tried peacefully at first, and then they directly interfered with some of the logging equipment. And you can bet your bottom dollar the police were there that day and arrested these guys. But the logging was stopped. The logging did stop. And they saved this last little strip of forest that still provides some hope. So there's an incredible resilience there. There's an inspiration there. And so all this stuff, right, this structure works. But one of the key components, one of the things that I've been most impressed by relates to this awareness and capacity and people's desire for and need for education. Now, education in the Solomon Islands is basically the same as education in Britain. They put in this British educational system, and there's really no nativeness in the education of these native people. And I believe that native people who are being educated without any of their own history, without any of their own sort of sense of place in that education is worse than no education at all. I mean, these students are being taught biology that's based on stuff in the Solomons, and the examples they're being given are from Europe, Britain, and from outdated textbooks from the 1970s. So one of the things we've tried to do is incorporate education of government officials, of college students, of primary age school students into some of the work we're doing to try and set an example to bring the Solomons into Solomon Island education. Obviously, one of the big cruxes of this is recognition. If there isn't good governance, if there isn't justice, this whole thing falls apart. And I don't think the idea of good governance in the Solomons is just something that relates to the Solomons. It's not an internal issue. It's an international issue that we all should be concerned about. There's an international power in there right now, and governance is still horrible. I think that's criminal. But still, people in the Solomons are amazingly at peace about it. I get worked up about it, and they pat me on the back and they say, but look, we're here. We're still here. And one of the greatest lessons I've learned is that these people that are the place they live in have no other choice but to be at peace. They don't even think about leaving. And there's a great peace in that. And one of the most wonderful things I think I've learned in terms of sharing with these people is that when your hopes and the hopes of a people, a native people, collide, the potential for reinvention, the potential for a place to reinvent itself, the potential for a human culture to persist is probably the greatest of all. And I think the issue here is all about sort of memory and remembering who we are. And one of the greatest things I think I've been taught by Solomon Islanders is that, we're not as different as we think. And remembering who we are essentially, I think, is sort of probably the key to our ability, not only the landscape's ability, but our own ability to reinvent ourselves into the future. And so I just want to end really briefly with a poem, just because I'm not native to really anywhere except the planet. And I needed a native voice to end this. And a native voice that speaks of memory and remembering who we are, ultimately. So this is a poem by Joy Harjo, and it's called Remember. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life. Remember the earth whose skin you are, red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. I'd just like to thank everybody who's funded this work, and hopefully will keep funding this work. My wife, Catherine's basically shared in all the failure, any success, all the dreams, all that. She's part of this whole thing. And I thank, all the people in the Solomon Islands that it wouldn't make sense to name. And I thank you guys for coming out tonight. Thank you. Delta logging. It kind of doesn't make, to really name it, I'd have to go through a long story. Delta logging has a U.S. tax number, but it's not a U.S. company. I don't really understand, I don't understand it yet. It's based in a variety of places. Most of the timber goes to the Philippines that they've cut in that area. And none of the people that I've dealt with speak any English. So I'm still trying to, if anybody knows anything about Delta logging, I'd love to hear about it.
So from a biodiversity standpoint, what is the state of the forests that have been logged, like that one island you mentioned there that's been 80% logged? What's the state of the biodiversity there? And then What's the future of the land tenure there? I mean, the government's kind of taken it over. Is there any hope for the people to reclaim that or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Those alienated lands, people have been trying to claim those for a long time. It's a really difficult set of issues because a lot of the oral history has been broken. A lot of those people have been integrated into other areas, other family groups, other language groups. So a lot of the oral history is gone. And it was long enough ago that the structures you have today to document that stuff weren't there. I mean, it happened between the 1920s and the 1950s. So, I mean, people are trying to get back in there who probably have legitimate claims, but it's going to be very difficult for them because there are government-run plantations and then leased plantations that timber companies are running in those areas. In terms of biodiversity, I mean, there's a stark contrast between particularly the plantation areas and the native forests in terms of the kind of diversity you find there. Most of the endemic diversity in some groups, like in birds, really only exists in the native forests, but it's pretty resilient. You know, if you were to try to rehabilitate some of those landscapes pretty actively, you know, in probably 100 years or so, you could probably have most of the native diversity, you know, 70, 80% of the native diversity returning. And we looked in some forests, and that appears to be what will probably happen. Yes?
When you were there, did you learn to speak their language?
Yeah, I've tried. I speak a pidgin English, and then I speak some of the local, more trade in the Roviana people, which were this warring people, kind of like the Haida, or, you know, they were traveling around. So a lot of people speak Roviana, you know, you kind of want to face your enemy, you know, you got to know how to speak Roviana. So it became a trade language, and I speak a little bit of Roviana, which is a local language. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if like the market is so big for timber, if any of the economic alternatives have a competing market, or how to build those other markets so that there's not so much stress on the timber.
Yeah, you can't compete. I mean, the long and short of the story is there's no way you can compete with the amount of money you can make short term off of exporting logs, even exporting raw logs. All the little economic, that portfolio I was mentioning to you, the only people who would accept that are people who are committed to essentially investing in their future relationship with those forests. It's not, yeah, I mean, but that said, you cut your forest down for at least a while, you know, 50 to 100 years, you're going to have you're going to need money. And that money doesn't last very long because they get so little of what they're making off that timber. And usually the royalties aren't paid. I mean, these companies, some of them are like ships in the night. And that's why I've been working with some logging companies that are doing great work. But some of the companies are, you know, they'll come in, they'll log illegally, they'll get their license taken away. Another company will come back, and I swear to you, it's the same people. It's the same company. I think the wood's going to the same place. And, you know, that's something I need to do my homework on. I'm working with some people from Greenpeace to try to better understand that process. But the answer to your question is you got to have people who are committed because the economics don't work out for them. You can make more money off just cutting all the timber down. Make more money now.
I think recognition of landscapes and land tenures would kind of counterbalance that market need or value in that place just by, like, our National Forest Service is shut down on the national level, you know, from outside interests, like a conservation.
Yeah, we've tried some of that, but the Asian market is notoriously resistant to marketing campaigns like that, and most of this timber is going to China or places like that, and it's just very difficult to, at least from my perspective, I don't know if other people have another perspective on that, it's just very difficult to influence those markets, as far as I can tell. I think you're talking about market campaigns that would put pressure on people not to buy the timber or something like that, or is that what you're talking about, Kara, or no?
No, just like maybe just thinking like if there was more recognition and ownership, that ownership would counteract the market value instead of having just to produce other markets, just people having ownership, counteract the ability for people to come in and buy.
Yeah, if that ownership is recognized, I think that's true. The collective side of that ownership is recognized, yeah. Yeah, up way in the back.
It's
talk about the long-term vision, but in reality, money and booze and prostitutes, that talks to people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be the buzzkill, but the reality is those short-term, that way of thinking, that's the real future, no?
I guess that's why I brought up that slide about paying our debts. I think we need to invest in these places and serve those needs. I mean, we need to pay, if we have interests in areas where, for instance, a native people, their primary desire is just cash, maybe the best way to deal with that is to come up with the money to pay for it. Put the money where your mouth is. We don't have that money right now. We're trying to get it. But some of what we're trying to do is to interact with people who, the majority of the people in those communities aren't interested in that short-term gain, have some interest in not liquidating those forests really quickly. But I think, in answer to your question, I think you need to pay for it in some cases. But yeah?
Second question, totally related. A lot of the folks in your slides had blonde hair, and I'm curious, how come?
It's a really good question, and I've asked a number of different anthropologists about this. And it's something that's genetic, and it's concentrated in parts of the Solomon Islands and parts of insular New Guinea, where you get people, and it's not, in some places people get that from protein deficiency. Young children, their hair will bleach out or redden from protein deficiency, but here it's not that. These are well-fed kids, and just some of them, their hair gets bleached out like that. And when they're older, it's dark in many cases, or reddish. So I've been told that's a genetic thing. I don't know that for sure. Yeah? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Traditionally in conservation, it seems like in order to conserve an area, conservation groups felt like they had to remove the people to preserve whatever they were trying to conserve. And now it seems like there's a shift in groups have realized it's essential to keep these people there because they've always been a part of the landscape, and that is the reason it is the way it is, and that's what they want to conserve. Do you see a big shift taking place globally with conservation groups and wanting to keep native people on their lands and involve them with conservation? Do you see this?
So I think the question is, has there been a global shift in the sort of conservation arena to work toward keeping people in the landscape as opposed to removing them and putting a fence around things? And yeah, I mean, there has. For a long time, there's been that shift. But I mean, the reality is, on the ground, it's just very difficult. And in some places, the relationship between native people and conservation isn't very compatible. I mean, the gentleman who was talking about that question up there, in some places, parts of Indonesia, the native people there just, they don't have this kind of an interest. They have an interest in commodities, and that's, in some ways, they're right. It's what we did. They're just doing it on a much smaller landscape with more people. So yes, there has been a movement to include native people in conservation. I think it's critical, but sometimes the interests of sort of biological conservation and the interests of native people really just don't mesh. And in a lot of parts of the Solomons, they don't mesh. So the one example I gave you is one of the places where I think they might mesh. Yeah.
You've obviously been trained largely as a geneticist, biologist, but yet you have an amazing scope of interest, and you talk about land tenure and all these other things. Would you mind telling us sort of what might have been some mileposts for you in broadening, and maybe advice to some of the students about what kind of training would you advise, being deep in a particular field but keeping your interests open, or just some sort of advice about your educational experiences?
I don't know. Well, specialize in what you're inspired by, but inspire yourself more broadly. I mean, I did specialize early on. I was drawn to natural history, and I was fortunate to live near these big natural history institutions, which forced me to kind of intellectualize my passion and my desire to be near these places. So that, I think, was in my favor. But I mean, most of it was just being in place, being in these places, and figuring out how to be in these places and have a legitimate voice that people not in these places could hear. And for me, my voice was science. I legitimized myself cross-culturally through science. So, I got I never thought I'd get a PhD. I didn't want to get a PhD, but I did it to legitimize my voice. And I think you can legitimize your voice through activism. You can legitimize your voice through art or poetry, through song, through all different kinds of ways you can legitimize your voice. But if you're inspired by place, which I always have been, and by people who are deeply intermingled with place, what I did is I just went there. As deep and long, as hard as I could, I went there. And then, after the fact, when I was attached to those places and maybe understood a little bit about what what I could give, I then tried to legitimize myself professionally in the culture that I had to interact with, to really leverage all the resources I had at hand to, assist and work within these landscapes that really inspired me. So, I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but it's part of my life, I guess. Yeah.
Are there many Brits out there still?
Yeah. Yeah, there's some great folks. Yeah, no, a good friend of mine left Somerset about 50 years ago and hasn't even blinked. He's still sitting there in the Solomons on a beach. Yeah, Anna.
So I'm wondering, compared to the U.S. or something, and looking at there's so much culture and so much history, and it's so rich in tradition and variety, but they are unstable, and they're not secure. And so, do you feel like maybe our country has traded a lot of that tradition and culture and history for security, or I know there are a lot more differences between the two of us, but we haven't had a civil war in 150 years, and there are differences, but we're stable and we're powerful, and so I guess why don't we have what they have, and why don't they have what we have?
It's a great question. I mean, that's an awesome question. You can't have everything, but I think that's beautiful, and I think that's the problem with most of our lives is we trade inspiration and freedom and hardship and good hard living and good connection with our lives and the people around us for stability. I think there's this myth of individuality in this country that I think just addles us from the day we're born, and that whole myth is sort of commodified. I think yes, I mean there is a cost for stability. There's a cost for security. And whether that cost is worth it or not, I think is within an individual life is an individual choice. But I think collectively, on a societal level, those are the kind of questions I think we need to be asking ourselves. When we look at a place like the Solomon Islands, right, which is struggling because of the very things that have kept it what it is and kept it alive. I mean, I think that's one of those hot points we should all be engaging with and looking at to try to understand ourselves, because I think we have lost a lot. And we've paid for our security with a great deal of the connectivity and inspiration that we once had. We all once had. I mean, remember who we are. Remember who we were. We all were Native people at some point. All of us have that in us somewhere. I mean, I feel it. Don't know where it came from. It's misty, right? I have no oral connection. I have no place I'm connected to like that. But it's there. And that's a great question, Anna. I don't know how to answer it, but I think we need to look more carefully at these places when they're teetering. That balance is teetering, right? They're not on either end. They're right there where they're maybe paying for security with who they are. Yeah.
Yeah, with regards to the tremendous amounts of deforestation that's going on there, and you talked about how we need to pay back those things. What are the chances? What is the likelihood of those places being reforested? Being implemented, having the intense energy needed to go around and put individual plants and see plantations and areas. And also, I want to couple that with seeing ecotourism is a huge business now. And do you see them maybe contributing to that, to stability or building that infrastructure back up and kind of helping the economy along and helping the environment at the same time? I mean, I just thought I'd throw that out there and see what you think about those things.
So there are two things. One is what is the potential for reforestation and sort of garnering the kind of capital it's going to take to reforest, and investment it's going to take to reforest in a place like the Solomons? And then the other question is, well, can tourism or ecotourism, whatever you call it, play a role in that, I think is what you're saying, or stabilize the economy here somehow? And so I'll take the timber thing first, and that is, we're working right now on Columbongra. That 2/3 that's alienated with all the roads in it, it's a plantation, most of it's plantation now, that's managed by a company called KFPL, Columbongra Forest Products Limited. It's a company that is wonderfully managed by the British government as basically a barely break-even kind of company. They do make a little bit of profit. They pay a lot of people's salaries. They pay taxes, So it's a functional company, but they're limited in terms of how much profit they can actually make. They're FSC certified, and they're beginning to not only incorporate sort of restoration, natural forest management is what they call it, into their timber regimes, but they're also doing research on how to do this, and have asked myself and some other biologists to come in and begin to assess how biodiversity responds to that kind of management. So the British government and Forest Stewardship Council in collaboration are investing in that. It costs money. Simon Legasic, who's the manager over there in KFPL, was flying over the crater with him, with one of the elders from the village there, and basically he said, honestly, if we can't make it work financially, we're not going to do it. But what's interesting is I just think we need to compel these big conservation organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars to give more of that money to things like capitalizing reforestation. Right now, I think many of those conservation organizations, really almost all of them, are focused on sort of projects that make them more money, as opposed to spending their money on projects that really hit the ground hard. And that's a harsh assessment. I work for all of them. I get money from all of them. So it's probably a criticism of myself, but that's part of the problem. I think these things need to be capitalized as an investment. We just need to give money that we don't expect to get back. We do that all the time anyway. Why don't we do it there? So that said, the tourism thing, I don't think it'll ever be a stable part of any economy. It's just too fickle. Even when things are stable, right now, ecotourism is great. If everybody went into it in the Solomons, they'd make great money now once things settle down. They'd do great. I bet in 15, 20 years, it's going to be different. People are going to want to go to Club Med, or I don't know what they're going to do. What are our kids going to do? They got to rebel against something. All of us going around with backpacks and stickers and everything, maybe they're going to want to, vacation in Manhattan. I just don't know. But the one thing I do know is that it's fickle. And that's just been tried and true throughout Melanesia. And add in any kind of social tension, infrastructure problem, malaria, big problem. So tourism is great as part of it's like investing, which I'm terrible at. But what I understand about these varied portfolios is they protect you from the fickleness of one investment and all that kind of stuff. I think as part of a varied portfolio of economic ventures, ecotourism's great. But if anyone relies on it too much, it's problematic. And the Solomons learned that lesson really well in this ethnic tension. Tourism market dropped out, and it really hurt a lot of people who had left their gardens, who really depended on cash for food, and they had to rely on their relatives almost 100%. Yeah? And then I'll get to you, sorry.
I'm still trying to get my head around that level of deforestation on the island. And I just can't imagine that the climate wouldn't have been affected with that much. The soil temperatures, all those sorts of things wouldn't have been affected horrendously.
Yeah, on a micro scale, I think you're dead right. We don't have much data on that. I can go in there and look at, herps, reptiles and birds, which you can see are my focus, but I can go in there and I can tell you it's very different there. To some degree, deforestation, we're lucky in the Solomons in that cyclones have hammered this place, hammered it. So on a certain scale, a certain kind of deforestation is actually part of these organisms' repertoire. But when you log fast And generally when things are a little sketchy legally, you do it really quick. And when you log fast on these kinds of soils, you do cause dramatic changes. And they're taking away the entire overstory, whether they need it or not. And they tend not to leave the logs where they lie. They push everything out of the way so they can drag everything down to the coast. So it's these big, it's almost like they're just scraping logs down. So it's really, it's a lot of damage. But there are some companies, especially some of the indigenous companies, not always run by indigenous people, but run by people who've lived in the Solomons for a long time, that are doing a great job and have been logging in areas for many years. So it doesn't have to be that way, but unfortunately that pell-mell logging on Isabel has been terrible. And it affects reef ecosystems as well, and that's where most people feel that pain is their free protein all of a sudden is gone. I mean, you suffocate a reef, it becomes really clear that your neighbors have great access to protein that you don't have anymore, and people start, it starts really hitting home then. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question with, did they have medicinal purposes within the forest? Before, I don't know where these doctors are coming from. I know malaria has always been a big problem everywhere.
Yeah.
But I'm curious when you have an area that only 7 or 8 species of birds are found in the world, what are the rarities of things medicinally in the forest like that? And did they before use like a witch doctor or medicine man or something of that nature? And what is the average lifespan there?
So a question about medicinal plants, traditional medicine, and lifespan. The lifespan thing, it used to be quite short, 40s. But now it's pretty long. I think it's probably in the 50s up into the 60s. Average is probably in the 50s or 60s. It's varied. I mean, with the crisis, infant mortality just skyrocketed because all of a sudden people don't have babies in clinics anymore. And those mortality figures really are mediated by child mortality and mothers dying of infections after pregnancies, particularly first pregnancies. So lifespan right now is probably in the high 50s in the Solomons. I think that's the figure I heard at the last census, which is pretty good. It's a huge, huge improvement. In terms of traditional medicine, yeah, there's all kinds of traditional medicine, all kinds of wonderful plants that you take while you paddle. If you're going to paddle a long day, you can't have enough water in this little canoe. There are these plants people take, I guess, that are a little bit, there's some kind of an alkaloid that just make you not thirsty and you're energized. It's in the mulberry family. I have some of this bark. You actually chew these 2 barks together. It's great stuff. The FCC would never, or whatever you call that, Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Yeah, no, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. It wasn't really medicine people or shamans. Like I said, this is really, the knowledge was very collective, and people shared that. And there were elders who had huge amounts of knowledge relative to anyone else at any given point in time and worked hard to transfer that knowledge. But the transfer of that knowledge was really only limited by younger generations engaging with those elders to be sure all that knowledge was sort of downloaded to the next generation. And it's pretty good, But there's that, like telephone, that game telephone. There's a little bit of that, There's always something that could be lost. But in general, the important things I think are transferred. And right up until I went there, like the old man I showed you, his face with the beard, he has an incredible amount of knowledge in terms of medicinal plants. And that people use to a lesser or greater degree today as poultices for cuts and things like that. But a lot of that knowledge is going away. Kids don't learn about it in school, and I just think that's a crime. It should be part of their education.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we should wrap up.
Yeah?
You spoke a little bit about the resiliency of the people in the Solomon Islands, and I'm wondering if you think the oral traditions are resilient enough to retain those specific place-based stories when those places are impacted, when watersheds are impacted through recent events, and also how or if you think that those stories will change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the question is about story, and as these landscapes are changing, how are these stories going to be maintained? Are they resilient enough to be maintained? Is what I'm understanding, and might they change? All these stories are dynamic in some way or another, but what's neat about sort of an oral culture like the ones I've interacted with in the Solomons is that these stories are scripted. I mean, some of them are literally scripted. There's a physical meter to how you tell certain stories. And I've experienced this actually in places in the Pacific Northwest with the Hiltsuk people, for instance, in the BC coast. Some of their storying, and especially their songs, are incredibly scripted and are given to people, specific people, to caretake, to be sure that they're transferred. There is a little bit of that in the Solomons, but the biggest problem is that students are going away to be educated. They've got to be educated to become literate and have any kind of potency in these sort of contemporary Solomon life, and it's indoctrinated out of them. They don't want. They go home. They got to do homework. They got to do all this stuff, and in many ways, they don't have the time, the interest, and they're living in two cultural worlds. And those oral histories take time. It's time and repetition, and having the space to make sure every couple of months you're at the little pool with the big tree growing out of it with Granddad, where he says, that's the tree in that story, and there's the story. The storytelling is like that, and when you're in a place every day, in a tiny locality all the time, those stories are repeated and corroborated and are resilient as something written on a piece of lead that you stick on the forest floor. But when you start taking people to school, when they become physically mobile, when their lives culturally are very different than generations before them, I think the resiliencies of those stories are shaky. And stories are lost. I've seen it since I've been there. This old guy died. I'll just stop here, sorry. This old guy died, and I remember driving back to the capital of Western Province where Kolombanga is with his nephew. And he tried to tell me this story, and he stopped in the middle of it and said, in Roviana, I guess the translation would be a little bit like, that's where the story died now. Dead right there. He couldn't remember the rest of the story. Something had happened. It was one of the new stories that he had just started to learn from this relative. And the guy died of malaria before he finished teaching him the whole story. And there's only half the story now. Nobody else knows it. And there are millions of, there are a lot of stories, and they're going to vanish like that all the time. But that's one example of they're not going to last. So anyway, sorry, that's depressing, isn't it? Thanks.